to rock, paper, hand grenade. My name is JP Marzullo, and I'm filling in for Josh, who's on a vacation, sight unseen. We don't know where it is, but that's fine. So tonight, first thing I'd like to do is what Josh does is to start off by thanking our sponsor, the Wilson Hill Pistol Club here in Manchester. They can be reached on Facebook. They're also able to be reached at their website, which is wilsonhillpistol.org. So I want to thank them for the many years and days that they've done this for us. Tonight I have two guests, and I'm very excited about having everybody here. First of all, I have State Representative Michael Moffett, and then our main speaker is Terry Murch with TSS. He'll fill you in on what all that means. And the main discussion is going to be about how to protect our grid and what we need to worry about that may be happening. So I'm just going to start off, and Terry,
thank you.
Why don't you start?
Thank you, JP. I appreciate it. My name's Terry Murch. My company is TSS USA. We design and manufacture high-altitude electromagnetic pulse and electromagnetic pulse filters, which basically filter electricity and protect electrical equipment from pulses and from different electric phenomena.
So let me stop you there before we before we go any further. I want to introduce Mike, and maybe just give us a little bit about your background, and then Terry, you can take it from there. Okay. Sorry about that.
Sure, JP. Thanks so much for the invite. Great to get back down here to Manchester, where I used to live once upon a time, taught at Trinity High School, in the Marine Corps. And I think my job tonight is to talk about how we used to try to blow up grid systems, which we did in Desert Storm in Kuwait. And so I'll have a few questions about security of these systems, and a fascinating topic. And I'm really looking forward to hearing, and I have some questions about the Great Blackout of 1965, which JP may or may not remember.
I do.
So happy to be here.
Thank you.
Very
Terry, go ahead. Give them a little of your background and talk about your company.
So TSS has been in business since 2008. Predominantly, we're a defense contractor. Right now, 95% of our business is supporting the U.S. military and government agencies. This is an area that is, for good or bad, is a growth area. So EMP is becoming a more, I'm going to say, concerning area. We were talking earlier, the three of us, about the Chinese, for instance. The Chinese military doctrine to defeat a superior enemy is to attack its grid and its critical infrastructures. And one way that you do that is either through cyber or EMP, electromagnetic pulse. Just to give a quick overview of electromagnetic pulse, EMP can be developed or propagated through really three different mediums. An atomic weapon detonated in the atmosphere 250 miles over the center of the country would pretty much disrupt and destroy a large part of our electrical infrastructure, electronics. The expectation is that most of the country would lose its power, and a lot of the equipment that we depend on day to day would be destroyed. Solar storms, which we have had several of over the past centuries, have the ability to do the same thing. In 1859, there was a solar storm called the Carrington event, which at that point, the technology for communication was telegraph, really disrupted that particular technology. So you can imagine what it would do to a telephone or computer today. And then the last, which is called IEMI, intentional electromagnetic interference. That would be more of a terrorist weapon, a directed energy weapon mounted on the back of a pickup truck or in a landscape trailer that would then be used to target very specific areas, substations, water treatment stations, sewage treatment facilities, basically any critical infrastructure that could be gotten from a roadway. So just to give you an overview, hemp, with a nuclear device exploding in the atmosphere, it would start as a radiated, basically energy pulse. And what happens is this radiated energy pulse comes in contact with a cable, an electrical cable, 6 feet or longer, and that becomes a superhighway to take these pulses down to the equipment that is now susceptible or is basically going to be destroyed by this pulse. So that is EMP in a nutshell, if you will. So we're seeing more and more of this. We're seeing a lot of critical infrastructure being concerned about this. Right now, I was telling you, 95% of our business is military. We are working with power companies, communications companies, and public utilities who are really concerned about protecting their infrastructure.
So when we have one of these events occur, what's going to happen? We've had hurricanes up here and snowstorms, and it takes our electricity out I've had them out for a week. What would this do?
Yeah, if we had a true hemp event, what you'd end up having is a loss of power throughout the country, and I'm talking about a very high impact, low probability event, a nuclear device going off in the atmosphere. This would shut down pretty much all critical infrastructure. A lot of automobiles would stop running, a few would keep running. But what would happen is the pulse would occur in the atmosphere, travel down and connect to all the transmission lines in the country, and any conductive line from a substation out. There's been a lot of research. Transformers on the power transmission portion of the grid are pretty robust. They're running typically at 400 to 765,000 volts. So the insulation of the transformer windings is really pretty up there. It's a megavolts or greater. So these transformers will survive. It's when these pulses come down to the substations and you have transformers that are operating at 15,000 volts or 5,000 volts. Their insulation levels are much lower, and a pulse is defined in 3 levels: an E1, which is very fast rise pulse with a lot of energy, an E2, which is a longer pulse, and an E3, which actually is a longer pulse yet and affects the geomagnetic portion of the globe. All these are very destructive in their own way. E1 and E2 pulse are much more destructive to electrical equipment.
So just a couple of days ago, the Department of Homeland Security mentioned that we better be really careful with attacks on our grid.
Yeah. Good. Well, a great example is if you look at Ukraine and what the Russians are doing. They are targeting the grid. They are trying to destroy critical infrastructure. One, it deprives their enemy of needed services and equipment and what have you. It's also got a psychological effect on the greater population. So this is a problem.
So how long typically? If you were going to attack us or the grid, and maybe Mike can answer that, how long are we seeing loss of?
Along those lines, JP and Terry, I did have a question, because initially you were talking about a nuclear event taking the power out, and I know you're going to come back to that, and I know that's been thought about a lot, needs to be thought about, but currently in Ukraine, that's a conventional war. So if you could maybe make a little distinction between what you started with a nuclear event and what's happening. Like I mentioned before, 1991, my Marine Corps unit went into Kuwait City and they had no electricity. for everything. The lines were blown up, which we did some of that, and the Iraqis did some of that. That was conventional. So anyway, back to Ukraine. So the conventional threat that the Russians are doing, what's the big difference between that and nuclear?
Well, right now, the Russians are just targeting the electrical grid, their infrastructure. Nuclear, again, high probability, low impact. I'm sorry, high impact, low probability event. Got to make sure we get that right. So, in that case, you detonate an atomic weapon in the atmosphere. It creates this large electrical charge, which then couples on to all the transmission lines and all the power lines in the country. That then starts destroying all the medium voltage transformers. And one of the problems, a medium voltage transformer has about a 2-year lead time to be replaced. And that would be a pad-mounted unit, not one of the pole-mounted transformers.
And where are they made?
They're typically made in South Korea. And again, it's about a 2-year lead time. The reality is, I'm not too concerned about a nuclear event. I'm more concerned about a nation state, Russians, Chinese, a terrorist organization, building 2 or 3 dozen pickup trucks or landscape trailers with directed energy weapons on the back, and then going down and attacking substations. And just so you know, what would happen, they would go past the substation, the power would go out. Nobody would have any clue what happened. So they would send technicians out who would then check all the circuit breakers and check the equipment. And what they'd find is that the windings of the insulation on the windings of the transformer had been melted, and they shorted out. A directed energy weapon doesn't have any report. It's absolutely silent. It's rechargeable. So you can now go through and you can attack. I've been told there are 9 substations in the Northeast that if you took them down will create a cascade effect and shut the Northeast power grid down. And it would be down for, figure, 6 months to 2 years.
So, Kerry, I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about nuclear and conventional.
Yes.
The cyber attack is a third way that is out there. And
yes.
I mention that because, and none of this is top secret because it's in the...
Right.
But the Israelis apparently found a way to use, to hack into Iranian cybersecurity. And I guess that they took out some power plants in erstwhile nuclear facilities in Iran. So if the Israelis are doing that, apparently, the Chinese, us, so what about the cyber piece of this?
Cyber is, again, another component of this. And as I was saying, Chinese doctrine is, to defeat a superior enemy is to use an EMP weapon along with cyber. Basically, you want it using cyber to basically destroy software, get computers doing things they shouldn't do, sending signals, shutting down systems that you don't want shut down. So cyber is a really big part of this. CISA in our government is looking at both these components on how do you defend against them. And every day we read about Russian hackers, and they have a very robust program, and it's all directed at us, at the United States. And it doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, we're all in this together, and we're on one team, they're on the other. So
how do you, what does your company do that can help this grid issue?
Yeah, my company, we manufacture a device that goes on to the grid or a power line that when a pulse comes to it, it knocks the pulse down to an acceptable level so that the equipment behind it does not see the adverse effects. It doesn't see this huge voltage and current spike that would kill the equipment. And the whole idea is by protecting the last mile of the grid, where you're coming into a substation and you now are stepping power down to the transformers that are susceptible, our goal is to protect those transformers so that power will continue to flow. Good news is you could lose about 30% of the grid and you'll end up having rolling brownouts and what have you, but you'll have power. And give you perspective, with an EMP event and a cyber attack combined, you would lose all communications. I mean, basically, you would have a blackout, and you may not know what's going on, and your whole neighborhood may be black and shut down. You may talk to your neighbors, yeah, same problem. But you get 2 or 3 days down the road with this, and it starts getting kind of old, and you go talk to your local police, and they aren't quite sure what's going on because there is no communication. One of the problems with this, you start shutting down things like water treatment, and if you don't have water, you really have a problem. So these are some of the large-scale parts of this problem.
Well, you mentioned blackout, and I'm giving my age away here, and I think, I don't know if Terry remembers, JP does.
Yeah.
I think it was November of 1965. I was 10 years old, but we had living in Groveton, New Hampshire at the time, we had a blackout for a while. But come to find out, that was part of a blackout that encompassed the entire Northeast, from Ontario down to New Jersey.
Yep. And
I actually read up a little bit about that before I came in here, knowing what the subject was going to be. And it's scary. Imagine New York City with no juice. I mean, all the people still have reunions of the 8 people they were stuck in an elevator with for 8 hours. But the traffic lights didn't work. Hospitals lost juice. Presumably they had generators. So I want to ask JP if you were where you were, or were you affected by that in '65?
No, I wasn't. But I do remember it. I was out of college by then.
Okay.
So ages. But no, I do remember that. And the thing that I'm thinking of now is, we're talking going all electric, and first of all, I don't think we're ready for it. Someday we will be, but we're not there yet, in my opinion. But it would seem to me that this just adds more if there was an attack on our grid system and on the substations. And I'm guessing the substations, how big of a substation do you need, let's say, for New York? I mean, that's got to be different than we need for New Hampshire, probably.
Well, it's going to be multiple substations.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, just like it is here. And there are different sizes of substations all around the country.
So this would protect any of those, your product?
Yeah, the idea would be to protect the transformers in the substation so that we are then mitigating the pulse,
Yep.
so that it's not, we don't want it destroying the transformers. We want to keep our equipment up and running. It's one thing to lose power for a few days. It's something else to lose power for 2 years. So, I mean, think of the hottest day or the coldest day of the year and having power go out, and you're living in a high rise, you're a little older, and all of a sudden your elevator doesn't work, you don't have water, you don't have power, you can't open the windows, or in the winter you don't have heat. After 3 or 4 days, that would be a pretty miserable experience. So,
Well, here, when we have short-term blackouts, it's usually storm-related, people can go to their cars and they can get warm in their cars.
Yes.
And I do spend, as you know, a lot of time in California. And California is Gavin Newsom and company really going all in and trying to go all electric by the 2030s. And I guess President Biden is similarly set goals. So as I listen to you all talk about losing the grid for however long or for whatever reason, if we say we were all electric, the implications for travel or transport, I personally just don't see how that's going to happen by 2035. But if it did, and we had a blackout, then you can't charge your cars. There's all kinds of implications, right?
Right, and that, the automobile industry has been pretty good about hardening their automobiles, and not all of them are. And some cars will continue running, and there you can go on YouTube and see an EMP test that took place out at White Sands, where they run a car under a site antenna, and they basically flip a switch and the car dies. The computer's been fried, all the electronics in the car are dead. Not all cars will be affected like that. But to your point, once you lose power, if you have an electric car, even if you have a gasoline car, if the gasoline stations can't pump gas or your charging station's not working, that car is good for a day or two, and at that point it becomes a big obstacle in the road. So without power, we really have an issue. I mean, I lived in New Jersey during Hurricane Sandy. I had a diesel generator, and people get really crazy. I went to refill my diesel jugs, and the line to get gasoline was about 4 hours long. So there was nobody at the diesel pump. So the first thing I had to do was go to the police officer.
This is in New Jersey?
This is in New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy.
Now, in New Jersey, I think the law is you can't self-pump, right? You have to.
You can't self-pump, but that's for your car.
But these were cans.
These were cans, and the gas station attendants were there to help people or to self-pump. But I had to get the police officers to keep the crowd at bay while I went and got diesel, because there's nobody at the diesel pump, and people were just out of their minds because they've been waiting in line for 4 hours, and somebody walks in, yellow can instead of red. It didn't make a difference. So just think what people would be like after 3 weeks of no power, no water, and that's the other thing, not having water. I mean, you're in the Marines, so you know the importance of this. An average person can live about 3 days without water. So there have been studies that show that in an EMP event, whether it's regional or nationwide, the government predicts that over the course of 1 year after a hemp event or a major EMP event, you'd have a 90% mortality rate within the population. And part of that would be waterborne diseases and people dying of thirst. So, if somebody hasn't had a drink for 3 days to see a puddle in the street, it starts looking pretty good.
Well, I just envision a breakdown of law and order. As you described what happened in New Jersey during that very relatively brief situation, if it's a extended period and people are desperate for whatever, water, food, gasoline, health care, what if somebody's having a baby?
Surgery.
Yeah. So I'm just, the wheels are turning, and so this is a very important thing that I know some people are thinking about. I think more maybe need to think about this.
Yeah. Well, talking about having babies or surgery, a hospital can only run 4 hours without a constant supply of water. So we aren't even talking about power now. We're just talking about the water utility's been shut down. And even if you have emergency generators, hospitals now are running out of water, and really it restricts the services that they're able to provide. It's the breakdown, going back to the 65 blackout or the 2001 blackout. Look at all the looting that took place, or any other city that you see that's had a blackout now. Multiply that times 100 or 1,000, and you figure if you're going to long-term not have any power, the first thing that people are going to go after are canned goods in the grocery store. The grocery store now no longer has power. Refrigerated food is going to go bad. It's just, give it away, because it's only good for a day or two.
Might be a few folks who head to the liquor store first, but I think,
Right.
or the drugstore. But I think groceries would probably, most people would think, okay, I got to get some food. And I know some folks, survivalist types. I mean, again, I'm giving my age away, but when I was around for the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was 7. But I remember that, and when you're 7 years old and all the adults are scared to death, that's very, you're scared too. Fallout shelters, so some folks still have fallout shelters that they have stockpiled food in. I have a friend, a mutual acquaintance in the legislature, who has he's shown me his basement, and he's got weapons and toilet paper and food. And so I know if there's trouble, you know where you're going to go, right? My town.
There you go.
But anyway, So
I mean, think of this: you are a young parent, and you have a sick child, and you need water, you need medicine. The drugstore is no longer operating. And you see somebody who's got water. People start doing desperate things, and you said it's a real breakdown. And people would do things that they would consider unthinkable under normal circumstances. But, I have a 2-year-old that I got to do something with. I mean, it would be chaos.
Well, you mentioned people doing things that they wouldn't normally do. I go back to the Rodney King riots, 1992, I think it was, and I was around. I wasn't there, but when everything broke down and there was widespread looting, there were people who had never looted in their lives who had gotten caught up in the carnival atmosphere. And some of those folks, like a day or two later, they returned the TVs they stole. But your point about societal breakdown and people, once the rules are not in place and they're not being enforced, they can't be enforced. It's scary to think about.
Right. I mean, think of it this way: your police departments that depend on communications, they no longer have reliable communications. So even if you have officers who are off duty, how do you get them in? How do you give them a call and contact them and say, we need help? That doesn't happen. How do you get the fire department to react if a house catches fire? Because, again, there's nothing to transmit that information. And that goes back to the rioting and looting and what have you.
So, excuse me. So do these things need to be battle hardened or battled ready, or like if you went into a town like where?
Right. Great. This is a great question.
Franklin.
Because we talk to a lot of different groups, companies, and this is an important distinction. What our military and our government agencies are hardening or protecting against EMP, the levels are much higher than what you expect anywhere else. And the reason for this, a hospital is not necessarily going to be a primary target like a command and control center on the battlefield. So the level of hardening doesn't have to be quite as high. So and the natural fabrics of buildings provide some level of protection. Again, the superhighway is the cord coming into the building, the wiring coming into the building. That's where the real issue is, because you have this huge pulse, and it through the air, it dissipates over a period of time and space. But as soon as it hits a power line, it'll travel 3,000 miles on that power line at full strength at the speed of light. So,
yeah, blow up all of those substations.
All those circuits on there that are susceptible then become basically a target and are destroyed by this. Now, there is a cascading effect because you destroy a transformer and even some of that power is going through and going to the next one, but that'll diminish over a period of time. The problem is when you have a pulse that's almost equal in its strength across most of the country, you don't get the same level of cascading effect you'd have if you had a single point of radiation. So
you mentioned radiation, Terry, and I'm thinking, again, the wheels are turning. Yeah. It's such an important topic that you're touching on. So back to Ukraine, Chernobyl, the infamous reactor, which was still that they had several reactors there. Mm-hmm. The Ukrainians have taken over. And again, 1986, Chernobyl was a meltdown, part of the Soviet Union at the time. But now, interestingly, the Russians, you were talking earlier about targeting electric, generating plants. So, and it's not just Chernobyl. There are other nuclear facilities that generate power there. And so my question is, in New Hampshire we have Seabrook. So there must be safeguards in place for a Seabrook station to not have a meltdown if electricity's gone, or
yeah, you know what? They'll have backup generators, and one of the really important parts of it's the cooling pumps, the pumps that keep the cores cool. I don't know how long their backup is, but I'm suspect it's a couple of weeks. I mean, so if you have a major issue, they're going to have to shut down, and I don't know what the process or the time frame is, but there is a process and a time frame to basically take these plants to an inactive level. If I could speak, it would be great.
So the 65 blackout, reading about that, I guess I heard there was a UFO involved, but I think what more likely happened, as I read about it, around Niagara, was across the border in Ontario, there was an overload and a backup, and things shut down. So all this juice that was out there had to go somewhere, so it went to these other places that were overloaded, and they shut down, and it was a chain reaction of shutdown like that. So if that were to happen in New Hampshire, I have to think post 1965 that the engineers figured out a way for that not to happen again.
Well, do you remember there was another blackout in 2001, I think it was, and that was a UFO, except the UFO was a tree branch in Ohio. So it fell on a line, and it did the same thing. There was an overload, and you get a cascading effect.
Right.
And again, you get all these circuit breakers taking place, and it just shut down. I mean, that shut down power from Ohio, from Ontario down to the Virginia, North Carolinian border. So to answer your question, no, it's still the same problem. And I suspect today it would be the same problem. The power grid is, I'm going to probably, I don't know the exact numbers, so don't quote me on this, but it's probably 100 years old, maybe older, maybe a little bit younger, but a lot of the equipment is older than, and I'm the same age as you, a lot of the equipment in these places are older than we are. So
that's scary. That's very
scary.
Yeah. Right, and that's actually pretty robust equipment. It's when you start getting into newer equipment that's not as robust. If you have a 1953 MG and you have an EMP event, that car is going to keep running because it doesn't have any sophisticated electronics. If you have a 2014 Audi, that's probably going to stop. So. So it's important to make these distinctions. But again, from a civilian standpoint across the country, you don't need to do battlefield hardening. But we talk to power utilities, we talk to water treatment sites, and it needs a scaled approach. And when I say scaled approach, during standard maintenance, there are things you can do. You can put cheap surge arresters into different parts of the system. And is it going to give you 100% protection? No, but it's going to give you a level of protection you don't have. If you're replacing electronics that you can switch over from wire to fiber optic, again, fiber optic doesn't transmit EMP. Do you need to put ARB devices in some of these areas? Absolutely. But the thing is, you can do this over a 5 or 10 year period, so you spread out the costs over this time frame. And every time you do one little thing, your facility is that much more protected than it was before you did it. If I spend $10 putting a surge arrestor on a circuit, you know what? That circuit's that much more protected than it was. And that's one of the things industry really needs to look at, is a scaled approach over a time frame. So you don't have to do this all at once. I mean, the government spends billions of dollars each year protecting its equipment, its assets, but it's a whole different animal there because that is a primary target. So
if you were the bad guys, what would your approach be here?
Boy.
It's a fun topic. I'm sure our listeners are having a lot of fun with this. But.
Yeah. Well, if it were me personally, I would pick either the hottest or the coldest day I could find for that season. And then I would pick, if I were in New York, I would pick someplace like Starrett City, which is huge, has high-rise buildings, has a mix of young and old. And the first thing I would do is I would attack their critical infrastructure to leave them without power. And the reason I do that is I like to see all the first responders going to help people out who are now on above the third floor, which if you're above the third floor, you no longer have water. You don't have an elevator, you don't have windows that open. And once I've done that, and I know I have all these people and the police, I would then go after the substations. And then I would, after that, go after water treatment and sewage treatment. So that then you now have real health issues.
So what kind of equipment would you need to do that? Is that something you can put in the back of your car or truck?
You can put it in the back of your pickup truck. And to build a device to do this, you're probably looking at less than $100,000. So, I mean, it becomes a pretty effective weapon. In fact, always the concern is that this becomes a very effective terrorist weapon. An IMI device, a directed energy device, on the back of a truck. And unfortunately, there are terrorist organizations that have the resources to go out and build a half dozen or a dozen of these trucks so then they can have a coordinated attack. And by doing that, they could leave a whole section, a whole region of the country. Let's say, again, just like New York, Ohio up to Ontario down to North Carolina without power, and do enough damage that it would be without power for somewhere between 6 months and 2 years.
So how would FEMA react to this, do you think?
Well, you know what? FEMA would be completely overwhelmed. So, if you talk to the government officials, they'll all tell you, you need to be prepared to live on your own doing this. And again, as I mentioned, you can't go without water for more than 3 days. And we've been to several conferences where they've had medical personnel that predict that after the first 5 or 6 days, you start seeing waterborne diseases. At about 10 days, you start seeing a fairly high mortality. Well, people really sick in 12 to 15 days, mortality rates start becoming high. And I believe, hopefully I remember this correctly, at 30 days, you see about a 30% mortality rate in the local population from waterborne diseases. I mean, that's pretty significant. That's a third of your local population that's died. So.
Well, JP's questions, this is wargaming, which
Right.
we do in the military. We do it in sports too. If you're
Right.
on a football team, you have your defensive coordinator look at your offense and figure out, okay, if I was going to beat you,
How do I do it?
Yeah.
Right.
So that's a great question, and I have to think. I'm sure that our people have war gamed these scenarios, and that's part of what your company's all about, right?
Yes, that's part of what we do. There are several companies like ours, and several companies who are in this particular industry specifically to create defensive devices and equipment and scenarios against this. You know, how do you defeat this particular scenario? And there are a lot of good people working on this stuff. So I will say that.
Well, there's a lot of talk of the Chinese. We keep coming back to China,
Right.
and I think before the Chinese attack us, knock on wood, they would focus on Taiwan first. And so I'm just, and I don't know if there's anything you've thought about, but if the Chinese were, I'm sure the Chinese have all kinds of invasion plans for vis-a-vis Taiwan. And is there a cyber electronic grid component? There must be. The Chinese probably want to take out Taiwan's electronic infrastructure.
You would believe that they would first target the electrical infrastructure. And the whole idea is, again, to deprive, between cyber and EMP, deprive Taiwan of its communication. You know, again, communications are very important for defense. And then go after the electrical grid. Again, it creates not just havoc within, as you're noting, traffic lights being out. I mean, think of how much of an issue would be driving through a crowded city or a crowded country without any laws or traffic lights or anything else to keep people in check. And not that people would be doing this on purpose, but if nobody has a red light or a green light, it's going to create problems. But there's also the psychological effect that all of a sudden you no longer have power. You don't have water. Your food supply is drying up very quickly. You know, these are just issues that when you start thinking and you start drilling down to a pretty granular level, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to start realizing what you'd be missing. On a cold day, you have no heat. On a hot day, you have no air conditioning. The elderly. I mean, think of how the elderly would be affected. Think of somebody who needs daily medicine and can no longer get that. You know, you run out of your anti-seizure pills, and you have a real problem.
So what would you suggest, like, the average person or average town do at this point? I mean, what we've talked about people who are going to hoard things, if you will,
Right.
like food and things like that. But what would you suggest?
You know, here in New Hampshire, it's a fairly rural state. I'm really low tech on this. If I had the ability, I would put wells with hand pumps in every town, and I would put several of them so people had access to water, because that's one first large problem that you're mitigating. And again, with a hand pump, nobody's leaving the tap open and letting it run out. A little exercise is probably good for all of us. But, you know, if you had a place to go and you could fill up 2 or 3 jugs of water, gallon jugs of water every couple days, and it was just a matter of walking somewhere, hand pumping that nice, clean, potable water out, that takes care of a huge issue. From a standpoint of communities, you know, again, we live in a fairly rural state. There are people who hunt. There are people who have gardens. A little bit of barter and a little bit of cooperation would see people through the issue.
Well, you mentioned rural nature of New Hampshire. As I said, I used to live here in Manchester. I live in Loudon now, but driving down here, I'm just reminded of how different it is to live in a city like Manchester. But where I live in Loudon, it's fairly rural. I have a generator, and I'm thinking a farmer who has weapons. Oftentimes, they're self-sufficient. Would it be fair to say that we hope this never happens, but if there is a major problem with the grid, is it fair to say you're better off on a farm than in Manchester?
Yeah, absolutely. So I used to live in New Jersey, and there are cities in New Jersey that, very urban and suburban areas that in the event of a EMP event, you would have a very quickly you'd lose segments of the population. If you're living on a farm where you're growing food, you have a hunting rifle and you can go get your meat, you have a well. I have a hand pump on my property, and specifically because this is what I do, and I'm not a prepper, but I'm a little paranoid about it, because even during a storm, if you lose power, you don't have a pump. I lost power this winter, and I went out and used my hand pump to get my water for my coffee. And I have a propane stove, so I can heat water up and use a match to light the burner instead of waiting for the igniter. So if you live in a more rural area, you're probably going to fare much better. In fact,
Unless you put a group together to
to
help each other, right?
Right. If you put a group together, and this is actually a pretty important statistic at one of these events, if you've gone camping and you know how to start a fire and you've gone camping at all, your chances of survival go up 50%.
Wow.
So.
Well, I camped out a lot when I was in the infantry, so to speak.
You're in great shape.
Yeah.
Well, again, I just being in Manchester tonight, I'm just thinking some of the density of the population. I can just envision, every man for himself. If the grid was down for an extended period, once the chaos starts, then the rules change, or the rules are gone.
The rules are gone, and I mean, if you're living in a city like Manchester, or let's say New York, you don't, access just getting out of the city would be a real problem.
Sure.
Especially if there are no automobiles or there are very few automobiles, those then become a very valuable commodity. And as we said, people will start acting differently than they normally would. And it's a little disconcerting to think how some people would react and act towards one another.
I think a lot of folks, JP in Manchester, are going to head to Ware,
Yeah.
which is your town, right? Or should I not disclose that? Or towns like Ware that
Yeah.
are just not so densely, And the 65 blackout, I got to look into this again, do some more reading on it. I'm sure there was some crime issues. Suddenly, when the juice is gone, the criminals are thinking, okay, here we go. And it was like 10, 12 hours of that. And it was a lot of it was at night. Daytime's different, but the wheels are turning, Terry. I hope this never happens, but it's something that I know some folks think about. Most people probably don't until now, right?
Right. Well, I see this every day. So, and you know what we focus on? How do we provide a solution before there's a problem? And unfortunately, our country doesn't have a great track record of this. Military intelligence had a pretty good idea that the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor. Intelligence agencies felt that there was going to be some sort of attack in New York City in 2001. The problem is, if we wait until the problem occurs,
Right.
then we're digging out of a big hole. Whereas if we're taking a very proactive approach, starting to harden the grid, and I will tell you, there are power companies now that are starting to do this. There are water treatment facilities that are looking at hardening their sites so that even if they run at 30%, their customer base is going to have fresh water. Sewage treatment companies, or utilities, they just need to be able to run at a level to keep everybody healthy and going. If we had a breakdown like this, obviously food stores would be an issue, and I think you would see some societal breakdown from that. At night, after a couple nights after an E&P event, you wouldn't have to worry about looting because the stores would be empty. So,
Right. Well, JP mentioned FEMA earlier. That's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, something like that. And I have to think that I'm sure that in New Hampshire, their municipalities and the state have some plans in place. And going back to COVID real quick, I know, JP, you were in the legislature when COVID hit, I believe. Yeah. And so Governor Sununu exercised an emergency powers clause, if that's the right word, something that was in statute, to allow him to declare a state of emergency and then do some things that normally the chief executive could not do. Now, this is COVID related. Now, the law that he cited was passed around 2004 in the wake of 9/11, so that when there is an emergency, you sometimes you just have to let the chief executive do stuff that you don't let him do when there's not an emergency. So I know the legislature is now trying to cut back some of the emergency powers for the chief executive, but that's every state's different. But I have to think that states have some sort of a plan in place.
Well, you'd be surprised.
How about in New Hampshire? I mean, have you talked to the people that you need to? Can we get you in front of people that you haven't been able to get in front of?
Not. Well, you know what? The honest answer is no, not really. So we haven't.
Nothing.
We've talked to people. One of the problems we see is we're having these discussions, and I think people have a really hard time conceptualizing how bad it would be. And the first thing I'm told is, well, we'll get a hold of our staff to come in and start working on it. The problem is there's no communication. Phones don't work, walkie-talkies don't work, ham radios don't work. You
go to runners like
right.
Like we had to, when our radios went down on certain training operations, you had people who were runners, and you always can have that, but that's runners can only do so much.
Right, runners can only do so much, and the reality is, I suspect most municipalities don't have a runner system set up.
Who's a designated runner for where?
Right,
JP, if there's a
So again, the problem is, it could be overwhelming. I used to when I first started in this industry, we'd go out to do presentations or listen to presentations, and everybody would start with a mushroom cloud. The first slide, we're going to have this. Again, this is a very low probability, high impact event. What we should really be concerned with are the pickup trucks or the landscaping trailers with directed energy weapons on them, because then you can selectively go out, you can target regions of the country, and you can do real damage. You can shut a region down for months, for 2 years. Think of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. How long that area was without power. Puerto Rico is an even better example of a area of the country that lost power and was without power, probably, if not for a year, the better part of a year.
So here's my cell phone, and it's tied into GPS, so you have a charge. I can charge it in my car as long as my it's not an electric car. So satellites still will do their GPS thing,
right?
And so my question is, so if there was a grid event, a bad one that was lasting for a while, if my phone is charged and the satellites are working, does this give me some capability to?
No, because that satellite is transmitting through a cell tower.
Okay.
And that cell tower has now lost power. So all of a sudden, you have a phone that might or might not work, by the way. You have a satellite that's transmitting whatever, if there is anything. But again, it's kind of like the grid. You can get a signal from point A to point B, where that last mile has disappeared.
So going back to when I was in the Marine Corps in the Gulf, we talked about SATCOM, satellite communication. Now,
Right.
And I'm not very technical, so I guess this is not SATCOM.
That's not SATCOM. The military SATCOM will continue working.
So military SATCOM does directly go to the satellites, and that would still work.
They also spend billions of dollars each year hardening their systems, so so they are prepared for this. I mean, the military and our government, from an official standpoint, is doing what they should be doing and need to be doing, and making sure that they have a robust, resilient system. What we need to be doing is taking a look at how we make our critical infrastructure resilient, and their microgrids, people who are building microgrids, and the idea is that you no longer are dependent on this large grid. You have a microgrid that, if the main grid goes out, there's solar panels, there's hydroelectric that will power a small area. And the idea is to make concentric circles so that you have overlap and you could do these more and more. Now, again, this is a fairly new technology and fairly new approach, but there are a lot of people out there who are trying to do this and are looking at doing, and there are a lot of success stories out there. So it's not like we're completely unprepared, but we are pretty well unprepared, and our grid is fairly old and very, very susceptible to issues. As I said, a tree branch shut down the Northeast for, what, it was 2 or 3 days. Now think if you destroy all the transformers, that now there are a few, some companies have spares, but not enough, and you're going to be without power.
So as a legislator, I'm thinking, okay, is there some legislation that we should be looking at or thinking about? I always go to Mike Harrington, JP, you probably remember Representative Harrington, who's on Science and Technology Committee. He used to be a member of the PUC, and he was a go-to guy for electric questions, of which there were a lot of bills that had to do with power rates and power policies and that type of thing. So you have federal laws, you have state laws. And I know there's emergency policies which are separate, but is there some legislation that should be considered?
You know what? There should be. This is my personal opinion, that any new construction, whether it's grid or power utilities, water utilities, should be looking at hardening their sites as they build them. Existing infrastructure, again, you don't need to battlefield harden, but you need to have steps in place. And I think if there was legislation that said, all right, you're going to do preventive maintenance, you need to assess what needs to be done. One of the problems, there's not really an assessment program out there, or a defined assessment of a facility, any kind of facilities, that would tell the maintenance folks where to start and what to look for.
So every state is different, and
Right.
every country is different. I'm going to ask you if you're aware of, are there any states or countries, I'm thinking Israel maybe is ahead of the curve on this, or is there a state, Terry, that you're aware of that has a model, or at least is ahead of the other states? And
Not that I'm aware of, but you are right. Israel is way ahead of the curve on this, from their banking system down through a lot of their critical infrastructure. And again, because our banking system, think of the disruption to that. Think of the servers and the storage equipment that would be lost, what that would do to our financial markets. So
we only have a few more minutes, so I'd like to, first of all, thank both of you for coming in. It was very enlightening, and I'm hoping that we didn't totally scare everybody, but I hope we've made them more aware of what the issues could be, and I think that was really important to find out. And on another note, that next week we will have a candidate in here, Chrissy Cantor. She's a candidate for Alderman in Ward 6, so that'll be the next time we have the show, and thanks again for coming, and I think we've all learned something.
all right, great. Well, thank you for having me.
thank you, JP. Yep, it's a pleasure.
Thanks, Mike.